Good afternoon to those of you joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment for people to load into the Zoom room, we will get started momentarily. Good afternoon and welcome to today's event with Congressman Jimmy Gomez, which is co-hosted by our friends at the American Leadership Initiative. Before we thank you all for joining us today, and before we get to today's event, we want to remind you to tune in next Thursday, July 29th, for a very special two-part event to discuss trade, sustainability, and the circular economy. I also want to mention for our longtime WITA supporters that our annual dinner, scheduled for October 20th, is already 85% sold out. So please be in touch if you wish to join us this year. We are reducing capacity a bit, moving to a larger space, and making some other changes to make sure we are as safe as possible for our guests. Information on those events and our other events is on our website, www.wita.org. We've also posted links to those events in the chat. As you know, if you've watched WITA events in the past, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with, even if you cannot see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Catherine Bedard at the Wine Institute, Cindy Cohen at the International Trade Commission, Dario Gomez at Boeing, and Jordan Stone at the Association of American Railroads. Welcome, Catherine, Cindy, Dario, and Jordan, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of our session. You should have also received an email with our speakers' biographies, so we can skip lengthy introductions today. We're very pleased to welcome Congressman Jimmy Gomez to the WITA webinar platform. Thank you for joining us today, Congressman. We are also pleased to welcome back to the WITA stage our good friend, Dr. Orit Frankel, the co-founder and CEO of the American Leadership Initiative. Orit?
Thank you, Ken and Diego, and to WITA on this event, for partnering with us on this event. This is actually our 8th member interview, which we're excited to do. So just one word of background, the American Leadership Initiative, or ALI, is creating a new vision and policy agenda for restoring American global leadership, working with elected officials and their staff and a diverse group of thought leaders, including business and civil society. You can learn more about us at our website, american-leadership.org. Thank you to Congressman Gomez for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. This is our 8th webinar, and it's been a really useful way to connect with members and really talk about the evolving trade landscape. So Congressman Gomez has represented California in Congress since 2017. Prior to his election, he spent 6 years in the California State Assembly, serving on a wide variety of committees. He now serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, where he is co-chair of the Ways and Means Racial Equity Initiative, and he's also vice chair of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Congressman Gomez has been a strong advocate of making the benefits of trade more inclusive, and as a member of the House Democratic Working Group on trade, he was very involved in negotiating the USMCA and led the effort to negotiate the path-breaking labor language in that agreement. So, Congressman, there are a lot of trade policy issues and legislation that the committee will be addressing. So just going to start asking some questions and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
So, as you know, both TAA and TPA just expired earlier this month. And, while there's no rush to renew TPA, obviously there's urgency to renew TAA and continue benefits to members that were receiving it. And I know there's now an initiative to hopefully renew it as part of the China legislation. Can you talk a little bit about the new bill and some of the things that it includes and how it will better support workers and communities?
Yeah, no, great question, Orit. We have been more and more concerned about trade and how it impacts workers, not only for the last several years when we started negotiating USMCA, but before that. And trade adjustment assistance was one of the main ways we would help deal with the negative impacts of trade that it had on workers, specifically here in the United States. But one of the things that we discovered is that a lot of the support didn't get to everyone that we wanted to support. So first, we're looking at trying to get it back on track as early as possible. And now, as a co-chair of the Racial and Economic Equity Initiative, we're working to ensure that trade policy improves the lives of all workers and historically marginalized communities. So this new initiative has a representative staffer from every subcommittee, including trade. So when we come out with recommendations or we're looking at policies moving forward or backward, it's all through that lens. How has it worked? Has it helped specifically the workers that should be helped, the ones that are often left behind? And it doesn't matter what part of the country, it really focuses on how is it going to help them. So I'm a co-sponsor of the TAA Modernization Act of 2021, which reforms the eligibility criteria so all workers impacted by trade are eligible. In the past, it was just the manufacturing sector, but now it's broader. If you can say and demonstrate that you're impacted by a change in trade, you're going to be eligible. Requires new outreach to historically underserved communities. That was not done before. So communities that are minority, they're going to have more direct outreach regarding the assistance from TAA. And then it reaches workers in their native language. So one of the things that we've seen is that there's a lot of barriers to just accessing programs. And what we want to do is be able to, if most of this workforce speaks Spanish, we're going to talk to them in Spanish. If it speaks Chinese, we're going to reach out to them in Chinese. And that's a way that they can be ensured to get those benefits. And then we also require data collection on workers, worker outcomes by race. That's something that we never follow. We never follow the data. We want to know who's benefiting from the programs. Are they women? Are women benefiting? Are people of color benefiting? And kind of get a better sense of who's being left behind by TAA. And that's because we wanted to make sure that these programs benefit the workers that have been impacted. Also establishes a new $2,000 childcare allowance as one of the things we've seen because of the pandemic. Not enough childcare workers, not enough resources. It's hard to get back to work. It's hard to look for a job. It's hard to do a lot of different things. So the childcare allowance is meant to do that. The bill also reauthorizes the TAA program for 7 years and increases funding to $1 billion a year. So it's a big step forward, but it's really kind of trying to meet the workers where they're at. One thing we also discovered on equity, you have to think about their skill set. And we learned this during the pandemic when we were doing outreach for vaccine signups, right, to get people vaccinated. Everybody was using online portals. Go to an online portal, put your email address in and sign up. Well, emails for a lot of workers it's not something they use all the time. So it can be an extra barrier, or they don't have a strong Wi-Fi connection. They don't have the ability to download or upload documents. Any kind of something. So we got to really develop a program that is goes to where the workers are at, but also at the level of access is critical. So it's a first step, but I think it's a vast improvement over the previous TAA program.
Yeah, it sounds terrific, and I actually read the report of the racial equity initiative, and it's really quite impressive.
Well, thank you.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
So continuing on the topic of labor, you were a leader in negotiating the labor language for USMCA, which was really seen, I think, as a breakthrough for, by the labor community. Since then, there have been groups that have expressed frustration with the Mexican's government lack of enforcement. And we're now involved with a case, with General Motors. How do you feel that they're doing in terms of implementing the provisions?
Let me give a little context. So when we were negotiating with the White House on the USMCA, the provisional changes that we wanted, we did a lot of outreach to people who were working to empower workers in Mexico. We took trips down there. And I had also the benefit of just understanding the history and some of the culture and political culture of Mexico, because I studied it when I was an undergrad. My parents are from Mexico. And I was, kind of to date myself, I graduated high school in 1993. So I saw, and I was at a community college, and as NAFTA was being implemented, I saw the benefits and the negative aspects of it for both our country, Mexico, and Canada. But one of the things that we always knew, that implementing any kind of changes where we would empower workers in Mexico were going to be difficult, and enforcing it was going to be difficult. And the reason why is that for a long time, the way the Mexican government held power and the party, the PRI, was through different pillars. And one of the pillars was organized labor. Labor, business, the party, and the military, right? I think those were the four. It's been a while, and the reason why you need to know about that is the labor unions were always just an extension of the party and the government. And in order to reform the entire system, you're really changing the institutions and the culture and how power and stability was maintained in Mexico since the revolution. And that was the challenge. So how do we do that? We do it as we understand that it was a big lift for the Mexican government to stand up labor courts, stand up all their institutions in a short period of time, not having the resources. So we had to take a step to create an apparatus, which is a rapid, I called it REM, but rapid enforcement mechanism, or the rapid response mechanism, so that we could help ensure that any violation of the trade agreement, especially labor provisions, could be remedied in a short period of time. And the punishment was severe enough that it would cause a change of behavior, not just from the Mexican government or from the unions, the protectionist unions, but also the companies that operate down there that would often ignore what the government wanted in the first place. Because in some respects, in some areas, the companies were more powerful than the government itself. So it's so just kind of taking into account all those factors, and the USMCA went into force during the middle of a pandemic, a global pandemic, where things have to shut down. Things were behind. But I want to just say, all in all, I think that we're making progress. Bringing up these two cases in Mexico, these GM cases, is a big deal. And that the United States and Mexico reach a remediation agreement is a step forward to ensure that those workers of the GM facility, they're going to have their right to have another election and have their right to legitimize their collective bargaining agreement. Those are big steps, and that's how it's supposed to work. But it's a step by step. Right? It's kind of like building a muscle. This is the first rep that these first two complaints are the first two reps in building the muscle to strengthen the Mexican institutions and the civil society institutions to hold to the new trade agreement. So I applaud the Mexican government for investigating the allegations of ballot tampering, and just for making significant progress in implementing their federal labor laws. Some colleagues of mine thought it could be done like in the flip of a switch. It's not that easy, but they're moving in the right direction. We got to keep helping that. We fulfilled our labor attaches. I think we have 4 out of 5. Our environmental attaches in the embassy. We're building up that apparatus, and I do believe the success of a broad and forceful implementation of USMCA and enforcement will help lay the groundwork for other trade agreements. Failing to fully implement it will continue to erode the public's belief that trade can benefit not just US companies, but workers and communities here in the United States.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it really is a kind of an exciting template to replicate in the future. Okay, we're going to shift to some other trade issues. Okay. Has the committee started thinking about updating negotiating objectives for a new TPA? And how should, I know they're bringing in a lot of new issues into the trade discussion. So can you talk a little bit about how the new negotiating objectives may differ from be updated to reflect current realities?
There's ongoing discussions, just like when the USMCA discussion started, the pre-discussions had began. The meetings of the interest groups, the meetings of different I guess factions within the House of Representatives started, and it really didn't pick up momentum or urgency until there was something on the horizon. So there are those discussions, but it's slower than people would imagine. Not just because we're coming out of the pandemic, we're trying to focus on rebuilding our own economy, making sure people are healthy and safe, getting people back to school. So the focus is on that, which is completely logical. At the same time, I always try to look at the context of where the current members were, how many of them were around when the last TPA was extended. And the reason why is that when we got into the USMCA, for example, 133 or 135 had never voted on a trade agreement. I bet you it's something similar when it comes to TPA. How many people were actually around? So there's going to be some educational component, having the members that are not on the trade subcommittee or on Ways and Means educated about the different components, and some of them know a lot, but we gotta make sure that we start those discussions in earnest. But there's still time. In the end, any renewal of TPA must ensure that the executive has meaningfully partners with Congress on all trade negotiations and agreements. There's a little storm brewing, so don't let it scare you. And so we want to have that say. We don't want to just get it after the fact. We want to be consulted. And I know when the new USMCA, those negotiations started, Democrats were in the minority when Trump got into office. So it's, but we want to make sure that we're involved sooner. We also want to make sure it reflects, TPA reflects our values, right? And it builds on what we did with USMCA, including related to workers' rights and the environment. So it's, there's some components emerging, but it's still in the initial discussions. So people still have, there's not going to be a bill tomorrow, I don't think. So there's still time for people to get involved and to make their perspectives known.
Good to know. I'm going to run through just a series of other quick issues. So as you know, the West has just been subject to just blazing temperatures, fires, and other, climate extremities. So I think everyone feels like climate change is really getting harder to ignore. And then, we have the EU that's just come out with their new climate program. So what is your and the committee's thinking about how to take climate into a future trade accord, carbon pricing, some of those issues?
No, great question. Climate is now one of the big issues that the caucus has rallied around, and on everything from transportation to workforce development to trade. Environment is a big concern. It was one of the sections that we had to, within the working group for the USMCA, to negotiate. I was offered to either do the environmental section or the labor section, specifically the labor rapid enforcement section. I chose the labor because I thought it was the linchpin. The environmental one was the toughest one. And that's because the Republicans do not see, in my opinion, they don't believe that trade should have anything, or environment should have anything to do with trade policy. That's not where the Democrats are. We need to, trade as a powerful tool to advance not only our economic agenda, but also our environmental agenda and our worker right agenda throughout the globe. So this is something, and it was the hardest. I think the people that did not vote for the USMCA did so on the fact that they believed that it was not strong enough on climate change. It's specific. We asked and we wanted to have some component regarding mentioning climate change. It was a red line for the administration. So this is going to be a bigger and bigger component moving forward. I think even Kamala Harris didn't vote for it in the Senate based on that issue. So so we gotta do more on it. But trade policy builds off, like new trade policy builds off the last trade policy, right? The last agreement. USMCA had about 50% of TPP was made up of a lot of the TPP components of the agreement. So in there are certain provisions that we want to move forward. Making sure that instead of having the burden of proof where you have to prove, for example, you have to prove that an environmental violation impacts trade. Now under the USMCA, an environmental violation is assumed to impact trade. Before it was almost impossible to prove. Mm-hmm. Now they have to prove that it doesn't. So we want to move those components within USMCA forward. And that's because if we had people who didn't vote for it because they thought it didn't go far enough, we're going to have to do even more. Strengthening air, water, and land protections in the trade agreements is essential. Incentivizing trade in sustainable goods and services, and only entering in trade negotiation with nations that have adopted strong environmental protections and records. Some people even say adopted the Paris Climate Agreement. Most people were annoyed. Some people were annoyed that we didn't mention Paris, but we had sections when it came to mutually enforceable agreements that allowed us, the minute we got into Paris, that we can amend that. We still haven't done it, but we set up the foundation. So it's moving in the right direction, but it is probably the hardest part of the last trade agreement. When it came to the pharmaceutical drug pricing, drug patent protections, we fixed that by just removing that as an issue. But the carbon pricing, I think, is an interesting idea, something that we should have a discussion on and have a debate on. But I actually, when I heard about it, I thought it was an interesting idea, because instead of just allowing the negative externalities of a particular good to go to a different region, but it's still impacting the overall globe warming of the globe because of carbon emissions, that we could do some kind of tariff that would make that cheaper product before the tariff less competitive against a cleaner version of that same product within the United States, or another trading partner with a greener trade and economic market. So it's an interesting idea that I haven't been too involved in, but also the rapid enforcement labor mechanism that we put in was based on the Peru timber annex. So you can actually do the same thing from some take the same kind of mechanism and apply it to different products that are in violation of environmental standards. So that's where it came from, was the Peru timber annex. And I didn't know about it. I actually read the Peru timber annex. Don't ask me why I did it, but I wanted to get a better sense of how it worked. And we made some changes and some improvements on it. But it was an annex and not part of a trade agreement. So it's, it was part of a trade agreement, but it wasn't as enforced. So I think in the end, though, it still makes a difference if you're willing to enforce what you pass. So in dealing with climate, it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue on when it comes to the trade agenda, and we have to just be ready for it. And it's a big part of keeping the Democratic coalition together and keeping the American public in support of trade. Sorry for going on for long.
No. This is very, very, very helpful. And yeah, it's interesting, because I think most people would have assumed that the labor provisions were the hardest to negotiate. All right, I'm going to move to tariffs. So you've expressed concern regarding the continuation of some of the Trump 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel. And then, do you think that the administration should lift them? And then what about the exemptions to the 301 tariffs on China, which are scheduled to expire in December?
I definitely heard from many companies on how tariffs have made it difficult for them to recover from the pandemic. And Ways and Means has weekly discussions with the Biden administration. And while we're eager to find solutions, we need to give the Biden administration the time it needs to conduct a thorough review of the tariffs. And that comes to dealing with China, dealing with the steel and aluminum. And I know that they're not looking at the timber issue, but we have to let them have a little bit of time. At the same time, I know that we can create some exemptions for certain countries I think we should take a look at that. But the supply chains, the global marketplace is still up in the air when it comes to a lot of goods, a lot of goods across the globe. So we should open up. I think the economy, we should open up, get people vaccinated, try to get back to as much of a normal semblance of an economy as possible, and then see how the prices kind of bear out. My good example, I know timber, sky high right now, sky high. And I was talking to Lighthizer to USTR under Lighthizer about my concern about the sky high timber prices. And the reason why is there's a affordable housing crisis in California. We need to build more houses, and we need to cut the cost, and the cost of the building was going up. Now it's even more so. My fear is, say we eliminate the tariff, or we do something that we would bring in more of the Canadian timber, for example. Not saying we should do it, but if we do that, are we going to see a drop in prices that we want to see, or is it the supply chains and the marketplace is so out of whack because of the pandemic that you don't see a price, but then you also have the negative impact on the workers in the U.S. timber industry. So having kind of a slow go approach until some of this is some of the reopening, the pains of the reopening are dissipate, would probably be the most prudent approach.
Yes, our friends up north are getting very, very irritated about the whole softwood lumber situation.
Most people don't know this, but California has I think we're one of the largest trading partners with Canada. And we have a lot of Canadians who live in California as well. So they let me know.
All right, well, we can't conclude any discussion of trade without mentioning China. And there have been, as you know, just a large number of bills aimed at China, which have recently passed both the House and the Senate. And I just wanted to ask, what role is the Ways and Means Committee playing in trying to determine some of the next steps in addressing China's various non-market practices?
The committee is working closely, and the administration's the committee as well as members are working closely with the administration to first evaluate some of the Trump practices of slapping tariffs and how some of the agreements with China are going into effect. But we have to, I think, a lot of people have come to the conclusion it has to have a more comprehensive approach to dealing with China versus just these one-offs or slapping tariffs on their goods and then giving a lot of money to our farmers. We have to kind of have a comprehensive approach and just have a more not only thoughtful but effective policy towards China's unfair trade policies. It's not easy, right? I think there's a lot of people say that they have the answer, but our challenge often is that we're in a democratic society where we have a change of administration from one president to another, which thank God it did happen. But and the reason why is that they have a government that doesn't think in a single term or a year, they think in decades.
Right.
So our strategy has to also match not a administration by administration, but a consensus amongst Democrats and Republicans on a long-term strategy on dealing with China and just their trade practices and on a variety of fronts. That also, my first trip as a member of Congress, I only got elected in 2017. Was to South Korea. My second trip was to Japan, and I also got to visit China. And a lot of the other countries were also begging us, the members of Congress on these trips. They wanted us to be back in the region. So they were forced to go it alone on their own version of TPP. They want U.S. leadership in the region. Some say that's the best way to counterbalance the growing influence of China, not only across the globe but regionally. So I think that we should take a hard look at that, have a hard conversation. It might make some folks not only in progressive circles nervous, but if you leave the playing field, you leave just different parts of the globe without U.S. leadership, then you are going to have countries that don't have similar values when it comes to human rights, forced labor, environmental protections, when it comes to the world market. You're not going to get that kind of leadership for them. They will fill that void. So I think there is an emergence of maybe a consensus, but it's still not set in stone. The previous administration had more of a go it alone attitude, but I think that having a strong set of partners is going to be key. And they're taking steps. You know, I was just listening to something on, you saw some about China possibly hacking Microsoft, and how the US worked with the European allies and the NATO allies to come out with statements condemning those breaches. Slowly but surely getting back in the arena and building confidence amongst our allies that we're going to be there if they're with us. Baby steps, but we're going to get there. But we gotta think not in a single presidential term, but in decades.
Well, that's going to be a challenge, but we're happy to have you on the case. And I see Ken, and I see that we have quite a bit of questions. So I'm going to turn it over to him in the audience.
On Ways and Means, if I in order to make it to the top dais, I have to be there about 20 years. So I'll have decades, hopefully. I'll have decades available.
Sounds good.
I'm thinking of my friend, our mutual friend, Adam Smith.
Yes.
He was pretty young when he came to Congress, but it took him almost 20 years to get the Armed Services chairmanship. So
well, same with Earl Blumenauer.
Right. Well, he's still got his trade subcommittee. He hasn't gotten full committee yet.
This is true.
Maybe I'll have gray hair by then, and hair by then.
So we've had some really good questions come in. As I often do, we'll try to combine a couple of them into one question if they've similar topics raised. So going to read one that came in related to CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement. Do you see an opportunity, one of the arrows in our quiver potentially to help solve the migrant crisis at the border is to create economic opportunity in the Northern Triangle? Is there a chance to modernize CAFTA in the near term to facilitate more trade and investment? For example, the rules of origin on apparel don't really work great for worker-centered trade because they're not, women are particularly in that area, want to get them chances for more jobs. With doing things like updating those apparel rules in combination with the new labor rules you did with the USMCA help create real and lasting change in Central America.
I think it's something we should have a debate on it and look at. As I mentioned, my family's from Mexico. I studied Mexico more extensively than I have Central America, but there was a real difference pre and post NAFTA in Mexico. I would go down to Mexico and we couldn't even get, you couldn't get any kind of product. It was hard to come by. You couldn't get any American products at all. And you saw the differences in quality, you saw the differences in price, all sorts. It was stark, and how people how people made a living. And my parents and a few of their family members came here before that. After that, there was the economy changed. Right? More of the auto manufacturers assembly went down to Mexico. Some of the tech went down to Mexico, and a lot of my own family got jobs in those industries. So no longer you had the need to go to the United States. And the reason why I'm telling that story, because it was repeated thousands, if not millions of times. And now the net migration to the United States from Mexico is zero, right? It's the number of people that live in the U.S. that Mexican descent that move back, or of Mexican nationality move back to Mexico, is even with the number that are coming up. So looking at how do we use NAFTA as a way to build up their economies so people don't need to leave, is something I believe that could be helpful in the long term. I think that's what thought CAFTA would have done in the first place. So you still have to look at some of the other, what else is going on in those countries that prevent that kind of growth of their industries to keep people in their home countries. So it's I think it's something we should look at when it comes to the apparel rules of origin. Yeah, I've heard that. Something I've been having some discussions, but there's no yet consensus here in Ways and Means on that component. But I agree. We have to have a different approach to the Northern Triangle countries to make sure that their economies build up. But they're having other issues, as you know, in those countries right now, where there's I'm not sure if those could be fair elections. There are folks that are just sending in the military to clear out the courts and the legislative branch. So there's some big concerns in those countries. But trade can be a transformative tool if it's done right. And so it's something that I would be open to.
So thinking of the transformative tool, again, we've got a lot of questions that come in, so I'm going to try to combine a bunch of them,
Okay.
give you a chance, and then I got one to close with. So the next one's going to combine digital, environment, TPP. We're going to put it all in one big bucket.
Okay, let me write that one down.
There's a lot of efforts to try to find using trade as one of the tools to combat climate change. There is some legislation and consideration about carbon taxes as a chance to fight climate change. There's also separately, there's been some efforts to do some digital trade issues. Might these be chances to find some areas of common ground with our trading partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the CPTPP? Maybe we're not getting back in TPP, but finding ways to do some digital agreements with some of those countries, or environmental agreements with some of those countries, including, the Biden administration considering a digital trade pact to combat China's influence. Anyway, throwing a lot out there. Thoughts on any of those?
Yeah, the climate change issue, the tariff, it's something that it's interesting. It's an interesting idea. Anytime we look at tariffs, we got to think about what kind of impact it's going to have on the prices for goods that Americans want to purchase, right? They're not necessarily bad, but it's a tool. And the people who end up paying the higher cost of those products, as all of you know, the people watching know, are the American consumer, right? The importer, so it's something that we need to look at. But I think that if we do it correctly, the question becomes, can we do it where it doesn't hinder or cost the American taxpayer too much? Can it be done in a way that it gives certain industries in the United States more of a competitive advantage because they abide by stricter environmental policies? They take into account the carbon emissions. They've already kind of taken steps to mitigate that. So I think it's an interesting idea, but I also want to say, hey, what kind of impact will it have on workers, prices across the board? But not saying that it's not something that is doable. When it comes to digital trade, it's something that when it comes to digital trade, when it comes to patent protection, when it comes to a lot of that, it's becoming a bigger part of our economy. And if we're not flexible enough to deal with it, then we can be missing some huge opportunities. More and more services are a big part of our trading economy. So I kind of see it along the same lines, and we got to adjust our thinking and our trade policy to match. It'd be interesting if there would be just a digital trade agreement and what that would look like. I'm open to it. I would love to have that debate, especially when it comes to coming from the California perspective, when we're home to Silicon Valley. Los Angeles, Silicon Beach, and just kind of the proximity and the relationship that California and the West Coast has with Asia. It's something that I would be open to, and see what would emerge.
Terrific. I think we're all anxious to see what might emerge on several of those fronts. So the last question, coming from a friend of WITA's, but not a relation, I'm told, of yours, Dario Gomez. It was asking, what are the major trade issues that you're hearing from the district and in California? This is sort of the closing question, but what are some of the priorities that you're hearing from your district and constituents?
Great question. Trade, so like trade is almost like in some areas they don't really see it. They don't know that they're being impacted by trade. They only see the higher the price or the availability of good or a job, right, that they lost. They don't see that how trade necessarily connects and why trade is important. And maybe that's because we're in a place now that you pretty much can get anything, right? Or at least you used to be able to get anything. And so what I try to do is I try to take what's going on in people's lives in the district and connect it to trade. Housing affordability. I connect it to the fact that of this dispute. I use it to educate people about the dispute of timber and with Canada and how that could have an impact. As I don't say it's the only impact, land, labor, all these different factors come into account. I also talk about how USMCA had put forward provisions to help workers down there and strengthening, making it so that we can hopefully raise the wages of Mexican workers so that the American worker is more competitive. So I try to kind of educate them on those components, because in the end, I'm not going to win or lose a vote on trade issues. I'm going to win or lose a vote on, did I lose my job? Did I are my kids have access to medicine? Do I healthcare, housing? So that's so I have to try to connect the dots for them so that they know that trade is a big deal. When the pandemic struck and people were trying to buy, and even now, trying to buy washers and dryers and refrigerators, and they can't get a hold of them. And I use it as an opportunity to educate them about how the supply chains have been disrupted because of the pandemic. And when they say, "Oh, we shouldn't bail out airline industries," then I describe how a lot of those airlines, companies ship products from overseas in the belly of those planes. So it's really kind of describing to them how trade impacts them. But they feel it on the on the bottom line. They feel it in their communities, but sometimes it's not upfront. And I think that's one of our challenges. We got to educate the public that trade is something that can be used, that can have negative and positive impacts on their life. And what we're trying to do is increase the positives and decrease the negatives for my district and for all districts in the country.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Really grateful for your time, for your work on behalf of your constituents and the country as a whole. We're very grateful to you. Thank you for joining us on this platform, Maureen. Thank you to ALI for helping with this event, bringing this to WITA, and your work that you're doing there to promote American leadership around the world. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for today's session. Remind you, as I always do after these sessions, if you are in a place where you can get the vaccine and you are eligible and it's available to you, please do so. It is important for you, your family, and everybody around you. Thanks, everybody. Take care and be safe.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you so much.